So I think the a rectangle shape would be a good place to start for our MP3 player. So we'll go ahead and just drop in a rectangle. Let's go ahead and decrease these values for the width and the height. So for the width, I'm going to go ahead and set that to about 50 millimeters. And for the height, about 100 millimeters. And your values can differ from mine. That's completely fine. So we also want to have kind of a rounding, a little bit of a rounding on the edges. So we can select that by turning on the rounding button here. And let's go ahead and change this radius down to maybe about 3 millimeters to get something that is kind of nice and tight there. All right. We can also start to name these. So this is going to be kind of the outer rim or top rim of our MP3 player. So we can start to name these because we're going to be creating a variety of different splines, and some of them are going to be duplicates, and we want to be able to keep them straight. So if I go ahead and now control drag this top rim, I can create a copy of that and now change the values here to create these screens. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this into about 40, maybe decrease the height to about 60 or so. I'll leave the rounding the same. And let's go ahead and pull that up so we get something like that. And we can call this something like screen. Okay, and so now we need to create something that's going to be a little bit more complex, and that is this network of buttons. So we want the buttons to come around in a circle and then a large button in the center, and then we want to have kind of a space for those buttons to kind of be recessed into. So there's going to be a little bit more of a complex workflow to create this, but we'll start with just a circle. And right now we can't see it because it's too large, so in the Attributes Manager we'll go ahead and decrease the radius. And we'll go ahead and pull that down to maybe something like that and get it into a good position there, maybe a bit smaller. Okay, now we want to have kind of an inner and outer ring on this because we want to define the width of those outer buttons. So for the ring, I'm going to turn this on. Right now you don't really see anything, so let's go ahead and change that inner radius to something smaller than our 10. And so whatever we define in here is going to be the outer portion of this button ring, and then the inner part of that. So we can go ahead and tweak that. Maybe something like that will work for us. So we've got this outer ring and an inner ring as well, but it's all contained within this one object. All right, so what we now need to do is kind of separate out the particular buttons that we want to define here. So to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and grab a rectangle. Let's go ahead and pull this down kind of in the center of this circle. All right. And so now I'm going to go ahead and decrease the values here on the width so we can kind of see it. And I'll go ahead and decrease this just so we can see it a little bit better. That's the height doesn't really matter at this point. So the width is the kind of the space we want to have between our buttons. So let me set that down to about 1 millimeter. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open up our coordinates manager here. And so now what I want to do is go ahead and let's rotate this. And let me rotate this in the heading there. So I'll give this maybe a 45-degree angle. Let's go ahead and control drag to duplicate that rectangle. And let's now rotate this minus 45 degrees. So we end up with an X. We can go ahead and make those editable, and let's right click on those and say connect and delete. So that'll give us a single spline that has this X shape in it. Okay, and what we want to do is use this X to cut out portions of this circle. So we'll take the circle, let's go ahead and make it editable. So we've got now 2 splines here. Let's go to our MoGraph menu and choose Spline Mask. Let's drop our 2 splines in here. Right now it's not really looking the way that we want, so what I want to do is change the axis. So we want to do it along the Y, so I'm going to go ahead and change the XZ along Y. And you can see we're starting to get something a little bit closer to what we want, but we need to change the mode. So right now it's combining A and B, but what we want to do is actually take, I believe it's B, and subtract A. So if we go ahead and say B subtract A, you can see that it's taking the circle, which is B, and subtracting the X shape. If we have these reversed in the hierarchy, for instance, we drag this up, you can see it's doing the opposite. In this case, you'd want to say, okay, I want to do A subtract B then. and that will give you these sort of buttons. Alright, so we have this spline mask. Let's go ahead now and say current state to object. We might need this later, so I'm going to go ahead and just turn this off so we're left with the spline itself. Now right now it is a linear spline, so I'm going to go ahead and change that to Bezier and go to point mode, or point tool rather, and I want to come in and select these points on the corners here. And actually, if there are any that are really close by, I'm going to go ahead and delete those. So if you've got any points like this, you can go ahead and delete these and just clean it up a little bit. That's probably okay to leave. Just anything that is extremely close, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of. Maybe right here. Okay. And now I want to take all of these points on the corners of the buttons, clean these up a little bit. Let's go through and select all those corners. Alright, get them all selected here. Okay, so we've got basically all the corners of the button selected. Let's right click and I'm going to choose a hard interpolation. Okay, now I want to create kind of a consistent smoothness on those, so I'm going to go ahead and say chamfer and just drag until I get something that looks okay. So that'll give us kind of a nice curve around the ends of those buttons, so they're nice and not quite so sharp there. So this gives us kind of a basic shape for where our buttons are going to be, but we need to have a spline that not only defines the buttons but also the outer kind of where those buttons are going to fit into. So to do that, let's go ahead and take this spline and let's choose to create outline. Okay, so I'm going to drag in here to create an outline, and I'm going to just do a very small outline here. But you can see now that we have an inner and an outer spline here. And we can go in here if we want to go ahead and set this down to maybe something a little bit smaller. And let's go ahead and maybe take this down to 0.5, maybe 0.2. So you can get something that's a little bit smaller, but you can see how we have now an inner, which can define our buttons, and then an outer spline that can define that outer portion. So we now need to separate these out. So we have the spline. Let's go ahead and say explode segments. What that'll do is take this spline, and you can see as I open this up, we now have a number of these splines here. So I can take kind of all of the interior splines. So it's basically every other spline. And I can go ahead and drag these out. And so I know that I'm going to treat these buttons as a single spline here. So I'm going to take all of these and say connect and delete. And we can call these buttons round or something like that. Okay, and then we've got all of these that are basically the outer splines, which is what's going to define our opening here. So I'll take all of these, connect those, and we can just call this something like buttons opening. But we still need to kind of cut this off here. So I'm going to create another circle. Okay, and let's go ahead and again bring it down into position here. And let's go ahead and decrease our radius. And for this one, I want it to just intersect just slightly with these shapes here. And I want to make sure to get it in the center. Okay, so I want it to, I'm just looking at the, let me turn off the buttons round. Let me turn those off. So what I want to do is just intersect it with these shapes here. Okay. And so now what I want to do is drop in another spline mask. And let's go ahead and see what we can do with our splines here. We go ahead and set our axis correctly. And so the one it's set to right now, which is A union B, is pretty much what we want. We've got A and then B we create a union of that, and you can see if we turn on our buttons that those fit nicely within that outer portion, but they get cut off right there in the middle, so it leaves room for our large button there. Alright, so we can go ahead and call this, go ahead and say current state to object, and we can call this button opening there. If we want to go ahead and get rid of that mask, we can, or we can keep it for later. So we've now got our button opening and our buttons round that fit inside of that. Okay. So we still need to create the kind of button in the center. So we'll go ahead and create a circle. I'm going to drag it down into position here. Decrease the radius and leave some space in the center of that hole there. And that can be our center button. So button center. And again, we don't have any geometry yet. We don't have anything to look at except our splines that we're using to construct this. So you can see we've got this outer spline, the buttons, and the inner buttons. Okay. Now the outer, the button opening actually needs to be connected to the top spline and also the screen in a variety of ways. So we'll go ahead and look at, we've got all these kind of separated out. In the next lesson, we'll start to combine these splines together to create our actual geometry and start to do some duplication of those and so forth.